So this video is going to cover the impact of a tariff in a large nation. If you watch the video I made with the impact of a tariff on a small nation, it's the easier case to understand, and it gets through the main points of the impact of a tariff. But we do want to consider the large nation case because there are some large nations, and the United States probably is a large nation when we're looking at international trade. So what we have to do first here is add in, we've got the domestic demand curve and the domestic supply curve. So we have to add in the world supply curve. And the world supply curve now has to be positively sloped because this is a large nation. So that's going to be the world supply. And then for equilibrium with free trade, we simply look at the price that we have with the world supply curve. And this is not just the world supply curve, this is really the world supply curve plus the domestic supply, adding this together. So as I talked about before, I have one video just to talk about constructing this supply curve. So this is, I'll call it SW here, but this is the total supply curve. You might want to call that the total supply curve. But here we have where the supply intersects demand, so that'll give us the price, and I'll call that P1 here. And so here's the quantity, that's going to be the domestic, that's going to be the quantity that domestic consumers will consume in free trade, in the free trade equilibrium. We take the price here off the domestic supply curve, and that gives us the quantity that domestic consumers would want to supply. And so that would give us here the start for the free trade equilibrium of P1. Consumption would be Q2, domestic production Q1, and then the imports would be Q2 minus Q1. And so this would be the amount of imports with free trade. A tariff is a tax. It's a special type of tax called a commodity tax. Commodity taxes shift the supply curve up. As I explained in the video for the small nation tariff, a tariff is a discriminating tax. It does not apply to all units of the good. If this is, say, steel, then it does not apply to all steel. It does not apply to domestic steel. It only applies to imported steel. So it would affect the world supply curve, and so it would shift the supply curve from the rest of the world up by the amount of the tax. Suppliers from the rest of the world will not sell steel in this country unless they can actually get the amount of revenue net of the tariff reflected by this curve here. So you shift the supply curve up to show the tariff, and you shift it up by the amount of the tax or the tariff. So I'll draw that in here, and so we're going to shift it up parallel by the amount of the tax. And so we'll call that the total supply curve plus the tariff, and we'll call that tariff amount T. And so again, the vertical distance between these two curves is the amount of the tariff. In the book, they don't draw these supply curves in. I'm going to draw them in here so you can see where the equilibrium is coming from. And then, but we don't shift this domestic supply curve. Domestic suppliers don't pay this. This is, the tariff is a tax not on all steel, not on the steel produced by domestic suppliers, simply on the imported steel. So you shift the supply curve up. Now, the equilibrium with the tariff comes where this shifted up world supply curve intersects the domestic demand curve. That's here. We'll come over, we'll call that P2. And then here's the quantity that domestic consumers will want to buy at the higher price. And then we take this price over the domestic supply curve right here. And so that's Q3. And so at this point here, the numbers, the shape of things look pretty similar. The only thing different is that instead of drawing these curves horizontally, they're positively sloped. But there's going to end up being an important difference. So if this was all there was, there wouldn't be much to actually go over. But let's summarize what we have now, because we do have that the price of the good with the tariff will be P2. The consumption, the domestic consumption will be Q4. Domestic production is Q3. Imports are now Q4 minus Q3. And what we can see is that the price goes up, consumption goes down, domestic production goes up, and because when you tax anything, you get less of it, you get fewer imports. Here's the imports with the tariff, here's the imports with free trade or no tariff. And so you can see that, yeah, that area of imports is smaller. Now we have to consider the consumer and producer surplus. And so you take areas under curves. We're going to do this here, and then we're going to have to do something a little bit different here. I'm going to draw in an area there. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to ignore that there. We don't have anything happening there. 5. And let's see. We've got this area down here as well. So let's see. Well, no. We're fine here. And then we've got 6 and 7. So we're good. We're good here, except we're going to have to add one area in here in a little bit. But actually, at this point here, this 4, I'll call that 4. I'm looking at that, ignoring that line there. No. Yeah, okay, we're good here. We're good here. So, consumer surplus is the area that's below the demand curve and above the price. In free trade, the price is P1. Here's the domestic demand curve area below the demand curve and above the price. That would be 1, 2, 3, 4, which I'm going to call is at 6 and 7. Don't forget something. 1, 3, 2. I was going to say, I need one more area there, and that's area 2. Okay. Now we're good. It dropped that while I was trying up there. So we're good here, and then the producer surplus is the area that's below the price and above the supply curve. Here's the domestic supply curve. Here's the free trade price. So area 5 would be producer surplus. All right. So now we're good. All right, now let's consider consumer and producer surplus with the tariff in place. So what we have here is, here's the price for the consumer surplus, the area that's below the demand curve, above the price, that's areas 1 and 2. Producer surplus, well, here's the price with the tariff in place. Here's the domestic supply curve, areas 3 and 5 are above that, but below the price. So that's 3 and 5. And then we've got government tariff revenue. And here we've got to do something a little different because tariff revenue would be the amount of the tariff, the amount of the tax times the quantity. All right, but the amount of the tax, the amount of the tariff or the amount of the tax is not the difference between P1 and P2. We said it's the vertical distance between these two curves. The vertical distance, we'd have to come down to the supply world here at Q4. The vertical distance between the curves is that amount. So we'd have to project this over here. I don't want to disrupt that, but here's P3. That's that price at. The full amount of the tariff would be P2 minus P3. And P3 is lower than P1, is smaller than P1. We know that because here at Q4 and P2, we can see that the world supply curve, the original world supply curve is below there. It's below P1, and so this number here has to be less than P1. It's P3, call it there. So the tariff revenue would be P2 minus P3 multiplied by the amount of imports. The amount of imports are here. Here's the tariff revenue. So it would be this rectangle here, but we don't have anything for that. So I'm going to call that 8. 8 is this rectangle here. And so if we want to come in here with tariff revenue, well, there was no tariff revenue in free trade, but now with the tariff, we have areas 4 and 8. And then deadweight loss. Well, we have deadweight loss. That mirrors what we saw in the small country case. It's areas 6 and 7. No deadweight loss in free trade. Areas 6 and 7 become deadweight loss with the tariff. So what we saw before is that, the tariff is inefficient because it creates a deadweight loss. It generates a transfer from consumer surplus to producer surplus. It protects the domestic industry and others, increases the amount of domestic production, and it generates revenue from the government. So there's a transfer from consumers to the government. But now we've got this area 8, and that's the thing that's different, and that's the thing that's special or interesting about the large nation tariff. In Principles Micro, we cover the idea of tax incidence. Who pays the tax? And we want to compare equilibrium before the tax and after the tax, and see how the tax adjusted. For generally speaking, with a commodity tax, even if it goes on the sellers, since the price generally rises some, we would say that the consumers, because they end up facing a higher price with the commodity tax in place, we'd say that the consumers pay a part of the share of the tax. With a positively sloped world supply curve, when this nation imports less, because it's a large nation, and this is the difference between this case and the small nation case, when this large nation imports less, imports go from Q1 to Q2, this difference here to this reduction in the amount of imports for this nation lowers the world price. The price in the rest of the world would actually now be P3, and then it would be P2 domestically, because the world price is P3 as opposed to P1, but then of course those imports of steel get taxed in the United States or in this large nation, and so the imported steel sells for a price of P2 on the domestic market, but the world price of this good, the world price of steel would be lower. What that would actually mean is that the foreign producers, in the case of a large nation, pay a portion of the tax. We say a portion of the economic burden of the tariff falls on a foreign nation. So area 8 is something different. There's nothing analogous to that in the small nation case, because the small nation cannot affect the world price. The world price does not fall when the small nation imports less because they are taxing imports. But for the large nation, it does, at least a little bit. And so there is a transfer from the rest of the world to the domestic government. This creates the potential, if area 8 happens to be bigger than areas 6 and 7, then it's a potential for this nation, the total surplus in this nation actually goes up. If area 8, because the total surplus would be 1, 2, 3, 5, 4, and then 8. So it's 1 through 5. That's all what we had before. No difference there. 6 and 7 go away, but 8 comes in from the rest of the world. There is at least the theoretical possibility, if area 8 is bigger than area 6 and 7, that this nation would be better off with a tariff. This is what's called the optimal tariff theory. It's a little misleading, though, because we can say very conclusively the world economy is less efficient. There is this deadweight loss. And so there are less gains from trade total being produced with the tariff in place. But if you consider only the well-being of the residents of the home nation, the domestic nation here, then it is possible that their total well-being, their total surplus goes up when they implement a tariff. So this could be, say, if you were a large nation, this is a way to, in effect, sort of tax foreigners, tax the foreign producers of the good. You impose a tariff, the world price falls some, you get, in effect, buy what you do import at a lower price. Of course, it's a higher price for domestic consumers because you add the tariff on there. But you end up buying this steel that you do buy at a slightly lower price. Now, this is a graph. It's not drawn to try to be careful about trying to measure any of these curves, but it does show the possibility, and I don't even know, it would be a close call if you wanted to measure it carefully here, if 8's bigger than 6 or 7, And then there's also the exact question of how much the world price would fall with this, because it's not just, this difference in the amount of imports may not be all that big. In one sense, a large nation is large in the world market. It's a little bit of a less of a buyer of steel on the world market here. But you do have this, it's the idea of an optimal tariff, and the fact that if you're a large nation, you can tax you can tax foreign producers, and in effect get them to pay some of the burden, the economic burden of a tariff. And so that is at least a theoretical possibility. Usually economists are going to downplay that, because if one large nation decides to impose a tax on one thing, other nations could respond, and if they respond, then they're in effect they're taxing you back, and so and then you end up, you might be swapping this surplus that you're taking from one country to the other, and you get deadweight loss for sure every time. So how much we want to play this up, or whether it's something that you can actually exploit or not, it is certainly questionable. But there is the theoretical possibility that the large nation could be better off with a tariff, even given the inefficiency, even given the deadweight loss, if this area that they're able to, the part of the tariff that they're able to collect from foreign producers, happens to be large enough. So that's a large nation. That's a large nation case. It's more complicated because you have this more positively sloped world curve here, but and so in some sense, the small nation one is the easier one to study to understand the full impacts here, but we do have this interesting thing of the element of the optimal tariff.